So for some time now, we've been having active conversation about the subject of evolution. And this course has paid keen emphasis on population genetics and its extension with how these populations evolve. Last tutorials, we had a conversation about the origin of species. Particularly, we discussed about 6 of the theories that have made attempt to explain the origin of life and where we have come from. So we reflected on the special creation theory, the theory of panspermia, catastrophic theory. We talked about some other theories and all that. In all of these, the consideration had been that we would now get deep down into the most scientifically oriented theories among these, which are first, Lamarck's theory of evolution, and secondly, Darwin's theory of evolution. But then again, Darwin's theory of evolution provides some of the consistent evidence that have changed our thinking about how life has evolved and has shaped the scientific conversation around the subject of evolution in itself. And so a great deal of this course would reflect what Darwin's perspectives are, and also what we have known since Darwin's theory of evolution, even things that Darwin never knew, but we do know. We think that from the time of Darwin's discovery, there has been a lot of advancements and discoveries in science that have made us understand the very things that Darwin wanted to communicate better. But particularly, we even have some significant insight that Darwin would never have dreamt of. And so we can say that we have come a long way with the subject of evolution. So it is important to recognize that if you're talking about evolution of species and how species evolve, we are talking about 2 fundamental principles. That is to say that these 2 things would uniquely shape our conversation about evolution and give us a broad-based perspective. So what are these things? First, we need to look at the idea of variations. And secondly, we need to look at the concept of natural selection. So first, variation. I'll be spending some great deal of time to explain these 2 concepts, variation and natural selection, not because they sound nice, but because they are critical to understanding of everything that's going on within this course. Variation is as simple as imagining how different you look from your roommates. Even though you and your roommates are all in the human species, you can record very significant differences. For example, your roommates might be fair and you might be dark-skinned. Your roommates might be tall and you might be short. You might probably be weighted more than your roommates and all that. Even though you are all within the same species and the same human population, living in the same human community, you can attest to the fact that there are some differences and that even identical twins cannot be entirely the same. That is important. All of these little differences that exist within populations are what can, over time, be the key for massive changes that can even separate these group of organisms into broad-based species, such that we form new species. But the roadmap from very little variations and differences among population to the broad concept of evolution of species is really an interesting view. That will be talked about when we're looking at the idea of natural selection. But then, what would natural selection be? So think about variation as differences that exist among populations. And so think about variation as the specific uniqueness that individuals have within a population. And when I say individuals, I'm not just talking about human beings. I'm even talking about the little organisms that you know, to the bacteria, from the bacteria to the higher mammals. I'm talking about all forms of life. And so the differences that exist amongst them would have 2 types of implications on their life. So those variations or unique traits or features or phenotypes that they have can either be beneficial to them in light of their existence, or it could be very detrimental to them in light of their existence. What I'm trying to say is that there are some specific variations or some specific traits of organism, unique features of organisms that allow that particular individual organism to thrive better in its environment, particularly in responding to the challenges that exist within those environments. And so we say those unique features enable that organism to adapt to its environment. And the concept of adaptation has not been new to you. This is something that you're familiar with right from basic school till now. And so if a feature enables that organisms to adapt better, that means that that particular unique characteristic or feature is a good variation. It is a favorable variation. However, if that variation adversely affects the survival or existence of that organism, then it's an unfavorable adaptation. For example, if you lived in a fairy tale, or probably imagine the world that Lamarck had been talking about, in the specific context, Lamarck says that giraffes had lived in a community where they constantly had to feed on lower crops or plants on the floor, on the land. However, due to increasing populations of giraffes and the exhaustive nature of their feeding habits, they began to deploy excess competition, and then they were running out of food. And so there was scarcity of food to eat on land. So giraffes then had to be innovative in making sure that they survive, in adopting survival strategies. And so they had to find ways to be able to now feed on the leaves of short shrubs or small trees, feed on those small branches so that they would be able to get food to eat, because the food on the land was almost finished due to enormous competition. This ultimately suggests that if you were a giraffe in that world that Lamarck talks about, your ability to survive would be critically dependent on how well you are able to stretch your neck to greater heights in order to feed from these shrubs and lower hanging branches of trees. That is to say that giraffes that were very efficient at stretching their necks will be the giraffes that can be able to get a lot of food to eat. And so they would also be the giraffes that will live longer because they eat well. And so they would also be the giraffes that can be able to reproduce because they have the energy and the resources to do that, because they are strong enough, they can mate and be able to give birth to younger offspring to the next generation. Now, when this happens, and these giraffes with long necks that develop long necks as a result of constant stretching of their necks give birth to their young ones. And if these variations are genetic, they are able to pass on these genes to their offsprings. And so they give birth to giraffes with relatively longer necks than other giraffes. The alternative to this explanation is true, that for giraffes that were not very efficient at stretching their necks, they are not able to get anything outside what they will get on the ground. And so largely, those giraffes would be starving. Chances are that they might even die young out of starvation. But even if they don't die young, they do not have a lot of energy and a lot of growth and development to be contributing a lot to the next generation by giving birth a lot. This means that they will either die without giving birth, or even if they give birth, those children or those offspring, those little giraffes, would also have short necks. Their story will not be different from their parents. And so they will also go through those kind of life crises. With time, due to very high challenges and adverse competition that they face from giraffes with longer necks, those giraffes with short necks would eventually fade out because natural selection will not favor them. Then the question is, what is natural selection? So, in light of this conversation about giraffes, for instance, natural selection is a phenomenon that allows the fittest to survive. So, in an evolutionary context, what do we mean by the fittest? We don't necessarily think that the fittest in evolutionary context is the strongest of organisms. The fittest is the one that has the most favorable variation and so is able to adapt to the environment very well, overcome all the environmental challenges, defy all the odds, and be able to survive, contribute to the next generation, and live successfully. That is the fittest organism. Certainly, if you have this consideration, then giraffes with short necks who barely can feed on height and so are starving largely or just getting little food to eat and cannot even produce a lot to the next generation, that is, even if they don't die so young, those giraffes cannot be considered as fit because they have very little adaptation. Those particular uniqueness that they have, that is short necks, is something that does not favor them at all. And so that is an unfavorable variation, and that does not make them fit. The alternative is true, that those giraffes with long necks are fit, and so they have favorable adaptations. So if you follow what I've been saying quite closely, you should be able to notice two things. That one, variation is basically talking about the uniqueness that exists among organisms. And by extension, you would understand that such uniqueness or differences can be beneficial or not beneficial. If it's beneficial, then it allows the organism to survive better within its chosen environment. If it's not beneficial, it's detrimental to the life of the organism such that it can make it struggle to survive. What natural selection will do is that it will favor only those organisms with the favorable variation so that only the fittest organisms would survive and those who do not have those fitness will die. So we want to end this particular discussion on variation and natural selection with what we call Darwinian fitness. And so when we say Darwinian fitness in the context of evolution, we mean special adaptations that are favorable variations and allow individuals to be able to survive in the population and contribute to the next generation. So that is a lot being said. At this point, I'm going to allow you guys to ask a few questions that you have about what I've said so far, and then I'll move on. Anyone with a question? Anyone with a question, guys? So in the absence of any question, I'm going to ask a few questions. So first question goes to Sandra in Sian. Sandra.
Yes.
Sandra, what is your particular understanding about the concept of variation in very simple terms?
It's defined as the differences among organisms that allows them to adapt to their environment.
Sandra, do you believe that all variations are good enough to allow the organism to adapt?
No, please. Not all variations. Some variations can.
So you would recognize that your definition covers some types of variations and not all forms of variation. So what do you think variations are?
Okay. Okay, then I'll define variation as difference among organisms that are beneficial to the organism. And then it's
I think restricting your definition to just the differences that exist among organisms is fine, or individuals within the population is fine. That is all that variations are. So the variations can be either beneficial or non-beneficial. We just care that it's a difference, it makes a difference. So we will then be able to come to whether that difference helps you or does not help you. So those variations that help the organism to adapt to its environment and survive, those are favorable variations. And then unfavorable variations do not help the organism. They work adversely against the organism. So understand it in that particular consideration. Are you okay? Sandra, do you understand it?
Please. Yes, please.
All right. Next person going to answer the next question is the person of Miriku Philomena. Philo.
Sir.
So in light of the discussion on variations, check the background noise.
Hello.
Yeah. Are you in your room or you are somewhere?
I'm on campus.
So why don't you find a quiet place and sit and have a class? You're just walking about. Anytime you have a Zoom class, just find a place.
Some other students.
Hmm?
Okay.
All right. Anyway, let me go to the.
Hello. Hey.
Philomena.
Sir.
It is absolutely your responsibility to find a place that is non-destructive so you can hear everything that is going on in the class. So in getting a convenient environment to sit for the class. But my question is, in terms of evolutionary context, when we say an organism is fit, what do we mean by fitness? What do we mean?
It means how successful the organism is.
How successful in what sense?
Its ability to reproduce and
Are you sure you followed what I said very closely?
yes, please. I was hearing everything.
I do not. You let me move to somebody to help you. Let me go to Kosa Ishmael. Kosa Ishmael. Ishmael Kosa. Yeah. What do you understand by the term fitness in evolutionary context? Darwinian fitness. What does it mean? When you say an organism is fit.
It means like evolutionary fitness, and in evolutionary biology, what I understand is like the ability of the organism to pass to pass its genetic material to its offspring. And like the ability of passing its genetic material to its offspring. Hello, sir.
Mensa Isaac Jr., let's hear from you. Mensa Isaac Jr.
Yes, sir. Fitness simply means reproductive success and how it reflects fitness simply means reproductive success and reflects how well an organism is adapted to its environment. We can simply call them as the way of reproducing at an athletic event.
Are you reading
Hello,
for
sir.
me?
Yeah, I'm writing it, that's why.
So take it again.
It simply means reproductive success and reflects how well an organism is adapted to its environment.
You added something else.
Yeah, in an athletic event. Yeah. So that's all.
No, like what does the in athletic events mean? Is it an example or is it because you are
No.
reading that's why you don't know the place of that?
The athletic event means a condition, a favorable condition. Yeah.
Ishmael, let's move. Thank you. I like the first part, but your example was quite weird and didn't come clearly. But it happens to be that
Okay.
you are not able to place it in context.
Okay.
Guys, realize that we are not telling fairy tales. And so everything that is being said here is quite important. It will be very surprising that after an explanation has been made on something, you call several people and they seem to have been lost on the core issue. I think that we should take a cue from this and know what to do. But I've always believed that you guys know what to do and you can always do the right thing. So when I talked about Darwinian fitness, I made mention to you that the favorable variations that an organism has enables that organism to adapt properly to the environment. If that organism is able to adapt properly to the environment, then it means that it will be able to survive and live long. If it's able to survive and live long, high degree of chances that it would contribute to the next generation. That is what you guys have constantly drawn inspiration from as reproductive success. Because if you're not able to adapt to environment in the first place, you are in crisis like the giraffes that are starving of food. Those guys cannot even think of reproducing because basic maintenance of their systems do not even happen. And so they might even die young before they get to reproductive status. So in terms of fitness, we look at fitness in terms of organisms' ability to adapt to the environment by way of its favorable variations, and subsequently, its an ability to contribute to the gene pool of the next generation. And when I say its ability to contribute to the gene pool of the next generation, I'm simply saying that that organism will give birth to offspring to the next generation, or it would reproduce. But enough said about these two things about evolution and variation and natural selection. Let's move on with some other things. It will be important for you to look at evolution from two broad perspectives. One, the macro evolution, and two, micro evolution. So if you're talking about macro evolution, we are talking about evolution of specific populations into species. So how did the human species evolve and become distinctly different from chimpanzees, who are our closest cousins? How did goats evolve as a different species from sheep, even though they belong to the same family? So that is macro on the bigger level, right? Then we have micro evolution, micro, M-I. Micro evolution respond to the specific changes or differences that exist within individuals in the population. The changes that happen occur in populations. Those will be micro evolution. And then macro evolution will look at the species level. These things are important. However, before we even delve into how species evolve and all of those things, the conversation about species in itself has to be settled. And so the ultimate question is, what is a species? So how can we say two organisms belong to the same species? So what is a species of an organism? Like, how do we form a species? What is the consideration in putting two organisms within the same species? So I'm going to take suggestions from all of you. So if you have specific responses to what constitutes a species or how species are formed or what is considered in putting two organisms in the same species or the concept of species explanation, let me hear from you. Just raise up your hand and I'll give you a call. Nuoklo and Slemus Ariam, your hand is up. Let's hear from you.
Species are organisms, with they have the same gene pool, and sometimes they're structurally similar, and also can interbreed successfully to produce healthy offspring.
All right, thank you very much, Aram. The next person with a hand up wanting to suggest something about what species are is Meku Philomena. Let's hear from you, Philo.
Hello, sir. Sir,
Philo, please go ahead.
a species refers to a group of closely related organisms that can interbreed to produce better offspring.
Thank you very much, Philomena. Now let's hear from the last person, Miss Vera.
So mine is similar to what Philomena said. They are closely related to produce and interbreed successfully to produce better offspring. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Let me take this last person, then I end with what I have to add to what they said. Hosa Ishmael.
Species. So, what I understand about species is they are simultaneously a reproductive community or like a gene pool and a systemic and a genetic system. Should I take it again?
Thank you very much. You're well understood, Ishmael. Somebody still wants to join the conversation. I think the person's hand is down now. So I would shape the conversation the way it's supposed to go. The point is that the discussion about species had gone on for a very long time in ancient Greek, particularly among the scientific community. It was important to be able to adopt a good classification system. And a good classification system would obviously be the one that correctly puts different organisms in their respective species. That is to say that if two organisms are placed in the same species, then it means they have the closest relationship and that those guys are almost common. But it is important to notice that the selection criteria in placing different organisms or various members in the same species should be clearly defined so we can be able to notice it. But there's a lot of history that I would want you to go and read about the journey of speciation from the first proposition that we had from Aristotle and co. till what John Rhee gives us about speciation. It's a very interesting conversation that you need to follow as a young biologist, not only for the purpose of examination, but also shaping your academic acumen as a biologist. These are things you really need to understand. But then fast forward, assuming we decided to group organisms based on how similar they look, and grouping into species, you realize that we will make a lot of mistakes and we might be deceived in a lot of times. For example, in the current system of speciation that we have, the goats and the sheep are different species, even though they belong to the same family. The horse and the camel are different species, even though those guys belong to the same family. Now, one may argue that goats are distinctly different from sheep in a lot of ways. So sheep and goats have a lot of differences striking that we can be able to use to separate them. Then it gives us some false understanding that in order to identify members within a species, we should look at how closely they look like or the kind of differences that they are in. If you began to have this kind of understanding that because you can list a few differences between a goat and a sheep, and that makes them different species, then how would you convince future generations that a red Indian and a white Latino and Black American, dark South American, and dark African, even white European, all of these variations or races of humans are in the same human species? Because fundamentally, the differences in appearance between a Black African and a white European are quite substantial. I would be tempted to believe that the difference in appearance looks between a white American and a Black African, that difference is more than the difference that exists between a goat and a sheep. So you realize that we can get a lot of instances where the conversation cannot be limited to, oh, how they look and all of those things. So in the long-standing conversation about species and how we've come a long way to resolve that, the bottom line emphasis has been that we should settle the conversation on the ability of those organisms to interbreed to produce viable offsprings. And so you can say a lot of things about species. You can contribute to the gene pool, blah, 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 and all of those things. In simple terms, if any two organisms belong to the same species, then two things must happen. One, those two organisms must be able to mate, right? They must be able to mate and reproduce. They must be able to have sexual intercourse or any form of sexual reproductive mechanism. They should be able to do that. But so even if they are plants, they should be able to be cross-pollinated and produce viable, produce fruit. So if any two entities are in the same species, then one, they should be able to interbreed, that's reproduce. But secondly, the offsprings that they will reproduce should be viable or fertile offsprings. Why is this true? Because there are some organisms that belong to different species that can be able to find a way to interbreed. For example, cross-species interbreeding or cross-species sex and mating has occurred in a number of times. For example, There are lots of humans in these days that practice the act of bestiality, that is having sex with animals. A lot of humans that have sex with dogs and other animals. The fact that they are able to mate does not make them belong to the same species. But then one will say the dog cannot get the human pregnant. But then we can have an instance where two different members of different species can they will mate, and then one of them will get pregnant. Example, in the case of the donkey and the horse, they can interbreed and produce an offspring. Example, in the case of the tiger and the lion, they can interbreed and produce the lygress. In all of these considerations, those offsprings that are produced are not fertile or viable. So even though a tiger can reproduce with a lion and produce a lygress is not viable or fertile. It can never reproduce. A lygress cannot give birth. It will just live its lifetime and die without being able to reproduce. The same applies to the situation of the mule, which is the case of the horse and the donkey and all of those things. So the bottom line conversation is that you guys will be able to interbreed and produce offspring, and that offspring must be a viable offspring capable of also reproducing to sustain that generation. If that's any of these two does not happen, those two organisms do not qualify to be in the same species. So a goat does not mate with a sheep. But even if a goat manages to mate with a sheep, those guys cannot produce viable offspring. A human being, like a Black American, can mate with a white Latino and they can give birth, and that child can also give birth. So regardless of the differences that exist between Black Americans or Black Africans and white Latinos or Red Indians, they are in the same human species. But also notice that within the species, there are subtle variations or differences, and that puts them into race. So for example, in the human species, we have several races of humans, and that is important to consider. So guys, anytime you're talking about species, think about two things. Can they mate? After mating, can they reproduce? If they reproduce, can the offspring also reproduce, or is the offspring viable or fertile? If all of the answers to these questions are true, then those organisms belong to the same species. If any of the answers to this question is a no, you cannot put them in the same species. Is there any question to the concept of speciation? Thank you. In the absence of any question, I will move on to one thing. Notice that in the formation of species and evolutionary line, a single organism may be able to evolve into another organism, and that is important. So how does this happen? So assuming within the same environment, and the situations or conditions within the environment change a little, and organisms within the same population try to adapt. None of them moves anywhere. They are all within the same community. They try to adapt, and that the adaptation is sustained over a long time, or there is a mutation. That mutation is sustained for a long time, and then it is incorporated into their genes. Over a long time, that species might evolve directly into a different species. However, in a situation where there's a challenge within the environment, and then some of the members of the population move to another location, some other of the species also move to a different location, and all of those things. All the various members who originally came from the same species that have moved to different environments will now experience different environmental conditions. The differences in environmental conditions would cause differences in their responses. And those differences in their responses to the different environmental conditions they experience at different places might cause them to evolve into different species. A typical example is what happens in the Galapagos Island that Darwin discovered, that originally what was noted to have been one species of bird, which is finches, has evolved into 13 different types of finches because the original finch population dispersed into 13 different islands. And in each of those 13 islands, there were different sources of food. And so if you're a bird or a finch in an island where the source of food dominantly were flower nectar, you will be interested in developing a beak that is quite long, piercing, and protruding, so you can be able to suck flower nectar from the corms. If you lived on an island where there are only hard nuts and grains to crack, then you would develop a beak that looks like a hammerhead or quite blunt enough and powerful with the jaws. If you live in an island where only pollen grains were available, your response to that will be different. So due to the differences in the sources of food on the 13 different islands, originally what was a single population of finches evolved into 13 different species of finches. And that is a type of speciation that can happen. So we say a phyletic speciation. A phyletic speciation or a phyletic evolution is one that happens to get a single population directly change into a different, one species changing into a different species directly. And then if it's divergent, then it means that the same species evolves into multiple organisms. You can see that in the human evolutionary history. That is why even though we have a common ancestor, we realize that we have branched off from our closest cousins on the evolutionary tree. So humans, chimpanzees, the orangutans, the monkeys, the baboons, all of us share a common ancestor, but we all branched off of the evolutionary tree at different points in times. And that's, even though we are closest cousins, we all are different species. And that is important. There are a lot of things I want to explain. Let me move to the context of isolation. So what do the experts say isolation is? They say isolation is a phenomenon by which a species is divided into groups among which free interbreeding is not possible. And the mechanism by which isolation is done is called the isolating mechanism. Now, let me tell you the story about the continental drift. But before then, let me not be deceived that nobody knows about the continental drift here. So anybody who can tell us about the continental drift for 30 billion marks at stake. Continental drift. If you know anything about continental drift, give us the story for 30 billion marks. I'm waiting, guys. I don't want to mention names. Continental drift. Guys, I just asked about continental drift. Let the Lord use you. Let the Lord use you. How do I pronounce this name? Let me just pronounce the last one. Enoch.
Yeah. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I know about the continental drift is that it involved the drifting of the various continents on the surface of the earth over a geological period of time across the ocean bed. Yeah, so that's what I know.
All right, thank you. Emmanuel. Ndezuri. Emmanuel.
Continental drift.
Emmanuel, you certainly have a terrible connection. Please fix it. All right, so let me continue. So Enoch provides a significant insight to what the continental drift is about. It is believed that several billion years ago, the Earth existed as a large mass that covered the entire surface. The land existed as a large mass that covered the entire surface of the Earth, with water surrounding it in that particular regard. However, inconsistent with the views of catastrophism, an event happened that caused the Earth or the land to crack into different masses. And so it got split along several fashions and divided along those cracks. And so water moved to settle in between the split areas. That is how we got to form the continent. There is significant evidence to suggest that this idea of continental drift is somehow true. What are some of the evidence? For example, if you have an electronic mapping system, or you have an electronic system to try to bring all the continents together with the tiny islands and all that, you would form a complete landmass. For example, if you look at the world map, see where Africa is and see where Europe is. It fits directly. If you bring it closer, it fits directly. You see, like Africa looks like a chicken thigh, and Europe has that curve there. It fits directly in such a way that you can arrange all the continent back, and then there's a direct fit like that. So it tells you that one time they might have been together, and that continental drift separated these land masses, and then water came to settle in between. And the water that came to settle in between formed the oceans, and the oceans divided these continents. So before the continental drift, all organisms that were living together, which were originally the same species, that were separated by the continental drift, are now going to experience different conditions. So for example, imagine an original species that part of it got separated to Australia and part of it remained in Africa. What that would suggest is that those that get to Australia would experience different conditions, like overwhelmingly different from the conditions that their counterparts in Africa would face. That means on a long time scale, like a very long time, on evolutionary time scale, those different populations will evolve into different species that will look different. There's consistent evidence to suggest that the environment has a lot of impact on the appearance of organisms and by extension, how organisms or populations evolve. How is this quite familiar? If you like, let's get an identical twins and let them live together for the rest of their life. They will always live together for the rest of their life if they have the same conditions available. Then you can have identical twins, go and put one in Iceland and let one of them remain in Ghana. And 20 years' time, bring them together. You must be convinced by someone that probably you might need a DNA test to prove that those people are indeed identical twins, because you may not believe your eyes. So that is the extent to which the environment has an impact on evolution in that particular area. So the idea of continental drift, what I want you to understand from it is that when organisms are separated, such that they experience different environmental conditions, they tend to adapt and then they respond to the environment even from the genetic level. So they begin to use some genes to evolve some features or mechanisms to adapt, and that caused them to evolve. But also, even when they gain new genes that can be able to do different things, they are not able to come back and mate with their original counterparts. And so the differences are restricted to each of the groups because there is something that is separating them. What is separating them that is not allowing them to come together and then mix the genes? Because when they come to, let's say, mate among themselves, then they would mix up the genes. Their offsprings will have genes from both sides. That's how they mix the genes. But because reproduction is not happening, like breeding is not happening because they are separated by a number of factors, then we say they are isolated. So the concept of isolation originally tells you that those organisms cannot be able to exchange genes. And so that separation exists. The next phase of this conversation is going to look at what are some of the things that can contribute to isolation. What are some of the isolation mechanisms that can exist within biological communities? Before then, any question? Maunyo.
Please, my question is,
Maunyo, we can't hear you.
can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I said that looking at the speciation and then the isolation that you talked about, it's like there's similarity between them. So does it mean that speciation or isolation can be put under speciation? Because first you talked about the difference in the color between the Americans and the Europeans, and then that of Africans. You realize there's a great difference. Now looking at the isolation too, we realize that there is some things that happens which bring about division and separation. And then you talked about continental drift. So looking at the continental drift, you realize that because it has happened, that's why we had Africa being separated from that of the Americans and the Europeans. So can that be under speciation, or then can that bring about?
Mauno, I get your question. Let me respond to you. So this is what our brother is trying to find out. We talked about the concepts of speciation, that two organisms are in the same species only when they can interbreed. However, even within the same species, you can have differences. Then we talked about isolation as a mechanism that does not allow crossbreeding or interbreeding to happen. Mauno, mute yourself. So, Mauno, this is what you're supposed to notice, that isolation is a mechanism that can lead to formation of species or speciation. So, for example, originally, if you have the same population of a species and you separate them by any of the isolation mechanisms that I'm going to talk about, so there are so many things that can separate them, such that they cannot come together and interbreed or mate amongst themselves. So when you separate them, the separation is what we call isolation. So the continental drift is an example of isolation. I will explain when I'm talking about types of isolation. The continental drift is an example of isolation mechanism. So when you isolate members of the same species and put them in different areas or conditions, the differences in the conditions or those isolation would make sure that they respond to those different environments differently. And normally, if I'm living in Accra and somebody is living in Kumasi, another person is living in America, and they respond to the environment differently and they inherit certain genetic characteristics, because interbreeding is possible, somebody will still go and marry from America and they will give birth to a hybrid who has a combination of both of the genes. And so the differences that have been accumulated still stay within the human population, such that the human species is not evolving so fast. Evolution happens so fast when the individuals are separated, they respond to the environments differently. Now they behave differently and they look differently, but they are not able to bring those differences together because they don't have the opportunity to mate. Then everybody keeps their differences to themselves. And then with time, the differences become so huge that the different individuals become different species. So for example, even though continental drift has significantly separated Africans and Europeans and given us different weather conditions and all of those things, for which you see Europeans having different skin color, for example, and Africans having different skin color because of the sun and all of those things that our genes have responded to, you realize that even though that is happening, you realize that we are still the same species because there is still gene transfer that occurs. But then again, for you to be able to get a different species or create two distinct species due to the different responses to the environment, those differences should be significant enough. And so it has to start little by little, and then it becomes huge enough to cross what we call the evolutionary threshold. So the evolutionary threshold is the minimum difference that should exist between two organisms for which they can be considered as two different species. So even though there is a difference between white people and black people, that difference does not reach the evolutionary threshold. And so we are still the same species. The difference between the goats and the sheep reaches the evolutionary threshold. That's why they are the same species. So what is the evolutionary threshold? The evolutionary threshold is your ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So if the difference accumulates to a point that now you can't interbreed to produce fertile offspring, case closed, you are different species. Mauno, do you get it?
Yes, please. I've gotten it. But when you look at talking about taking an animal from that country, as in the European country, and then bringing it to Africa, could there be a possibility that they will be able to interbreed? Let's say a goat from Europe and then a goat from Africa. Would they be able
because the goats in Europe and the goats in Africa are still in the same species, even though they might behave differently and respond to environmental conditions differently. The difference that exists them has not crossed the evolutionary threshold, so they can still be able to interbreed. So, for example, those dogs that are indigenous to Europe, like those bulldogs and the rest, sometimes some of them can interbreed with some local dogs. And then there are some of them that cannot interbreed with local dogs. If they can interbreed, it means they are still in the same species, regardless of the differences. It is only when they cannot interbreed then they are in different species. But always, chances are that if the differences that have accumulated has not crossed the evolutionary threshold, then they can interbreed. So,
okay. Thanks so
regardless of how similar the duck looks like the fowl, the duck can never reproduce with the fowl. But regardless of the differences that exist between the exotic poultry birds, foreign fowls, the white ones, and the local fowls, they can still interbreed. So someone else has a question. I can see a few hands up. Okay, those hands are down now. I don't know if your questions are still relevant, then we can look at it. So that is isolation. So let's get into isolation better. I'm reading, and then when I get to where it's important, I'll explain. So isolation is a phenomenon by which a species is divided into groups among which free interbreeding is not possible. And the mechanism by which isolation is done is called isolation mechanism. The term isolating mechanism was introduced by Dubaski in 1930. So isolation can be of several types. So we have types of isolation. One, we have what we call geographical isolation. What is this? The separation of two or more parts of populations by geographical barriers, such as forests, mountains, deserts, seas, is called geographical isolation. So you realize that the continental drift caused a geographical isolation because after the continental drift happened, various continents were separated by large oceans. So assuming there is a dog that was now trapped in Europe, that dog can never cross to Africa unaided. And so that is an isolation. They cannot cross the Mediterranean Sea. They cannot cross it in that particular regard. So that isolates them. There are some organisms that are separated by, say, rivers. Assuming you have a big forest, and then there is a stream or a river that flows from north to south. And then there are the same species of snails on both sides of the river. If you place two species of snails on both sides of the river, over a long time, because the snails cannot cross the river, the snails on the left and the ones on the right might evolve into different species because they are isolated by that geographic barrier, such as that water. So if any of these things separate communities such that the species are separated from one another, then that kind of isolation is a geographical isolation. So if they are separated by, say, with a forest, a mountain, desert, sea, etc., then that is geographical isolation. So apart from geographical isolation, what else can separate organisms? So another thing that can separate them is space, like distance. So there is what we call spatial isolation. It is the form of isolation due to a great distance. So assuming you have a girlfriend, you want to marry the girl and probably have children and all of those things, and one of the family does not agree, and the girl's father takes the girl to America and never lets the girl return back, and you are in the average economic class as a Ghanaian, there's no way you can have, you like in your lifetime, you have no dreams of being in America. Chances are that the girl will now have a different life, marry in America, and you never see her again. That means that you guys have been isolated by a great distance. So sometimes organisms or different populations might be isolated from with a very great distance. For example, the Neanderthals that migrated from Africa to Europe, that are the evolutionary ancestors of present-day white people, moved from Africa originally. That's why they say evolution of humans started from Africa, because the original Neanderthals moved from Africa. They evolved from those cavemen in Africa and moved to Europe, experienced different conditions because of the isolation of a great distance and different environments. And that led to different characteristics amongst even the same members of the same species of humans. That's why we have different races, because we're separated by very huge distance. It was until the invention of technology, for example, through the invention of the ship and all that, that we are able to come together as a human community again. So we realized that the white people had never seen Black people before until, for example, the year 1471, when Don Diego de Azambuja led the Portuguese in that exploratory Navy SEAL in an attempt to map the west coast of India and also discover the sea routes to India. Then they came to discover Africa, that Africa was around. Until the invention of such technologies, we were always going to be separated by a huge distance. And that is an isolation. So in that case, even if you were the richest person in Africa, you can't go and marry a white person and give them. That isolation was a great deal. So isolation by a great distance, that is called spatial isolation. Then we also have what we call reproductive isolation. So we've talked about geographic isolation. You guys are separated by a barrier, which is geographic. Then you have spatial, distance that separates you people, like those of you in long distance relationship. And notice that in every long distance relationship, the one in Accra is cheating. Somebody says I'm lying. Is it true or false? That in every long distance relationship, the one in Accra is cheating. Guys, is that true?
It's false.
It's false.
It's true.
All right, we will talk about that later. But it's been said time and again that in every long distance relationship, the one in Accra is cheating. I don't even know what causes the problem, but I would always conclude that the one in Accra is cheating. So, like something like a long distance relation, like spatial isolation. Then we have what we call reproductive isolation. So, reproductive isolation is an isolation mechanism which prevents fruitful reproduction of the individual. So it will prevent them from being capable of producing an offspring. So it exists in two forms. We have what we call the prezygotic isolation and then postzygotic reproductive isolation. So prezygotic reproductive isolation, postzygotic reproductive isolation. What is the difference? In prezygotic reproductive isolation, what means is that the barriers or the isolation mechanisms will make sure that the individuals cannot even mate in the first place. They can't mate. Or even if they mate, there is no successful delivery of sperms into the other. Like there is no mating or successful delivery of gametes or anything. Mating does not happen in the first place primarily. That is prezygotic. Okay, zygote is when the egg is fertilized by the sperm. So if the isolation is before even a zygote can form, then it means that anything that happens before fertilization can happen. That's anything from sexual intercourse to pre-mating behavior or nuptial behavior. That is prezygotic reproductive isolation. Then postzygotic isolation is that the sexual intercourse will happen or the mating will happen, but other mechanisms will make sure that they will not be able to form a viable offspring out of it. So let's see how it happens. So prezygotic isolation mechanisms are those that prevent interspecific crosses. So, for example, like I said, mating is not possible in the first place. So people, individuals of different species can never interbreed most of the times. They cannot interbreed. But in recent times, they can sometimes because of unreasonable and extreme behavior, like bestiality, like human beings mating with dogs. That's crazy, but I mean, it happens. So in terms of prezygotic isolation, it can happen in a number of forms. Let's look at one of them. One of them is temporal isolation. In this case, individuals of different species do not mate because they are active at different points. They are sexually active at different times of the day and in different times of the season. So for example, assuming two organisms, one is nocturnal and one is diurnal. A nocturnal organism is one that is active at night, and a diurnal organism is one that is active during the day. So for example, a goat is a diurnal environment. Goats are active only during the night, during the day. In the night, they are asleep. And then other organisms like, say, grass cutter, they are active during the night. They are diurnal, they are nocturnal organisms. Because they are active at different times during the day, it is never possible that they can interbreed because by the time one is active, the other one is sleeping. So they won't even meet like that. Then, so that is called temporal isolation. They are active at different points in time. And also, certain organisms do not mate until they reach sexual reproductive capacity. So for example, in termites, they get to a point where the queen, even among the female the winged reproductives, they go on what we call nuptial flight with the males. And one of the males would be successful in mating with the queen. And that's what we call nuptial flight. So if the time for natural flight has not been due, reproduction cannot happen. So in that case, because termites have their own period for nuptial flight, a mosquito at the time when mosquito is ready to probably mate might not be the time that a termite is ready. And so that interspecific mating cannot happen. In that, so a lot of species have different times within the year where they are sexually active. So if your period of sexual activity does not coincide with that of another species, even if one of the species is interested in initiating sexual intercourse, the other one is not interested. For example, assuming you're in a relationship with your girlfriend and you want to have sexual intercourse, and the girlfriend says, at this point in time, I'm having my period, and that is not possible. That is an example of temporal isolation. Then we have behavioral isolation. This refers to potential mates that are the fact that potential mates meet but are able to choose members of their own species. How is that true? You see, when a cock is coming to mate with a female fowl or the hen, they do some skills and they will just be moving around, stretching their feathers, and then bam, it happens. You think a duck can do those skills? They cannot. So, and that is what really attracts the hen. So if the cock cannot do it, the duck cannot do it, the duck cannot come and mate with the hen. Another example, birds. They sing a lot to attract mating partners. So every species of bird have their own unique sounds that they make to attract their mating partners. So the sound that the Hamilton bird will make is different from the sound that the sparrow will make. And so they cannot interbreed because the sparrow will never be attracted by the singing of the Hamilton bird or some other kind of birds in that particular regard. So, and also some organisms. What are some of the other reproductive behaviors, for example? Like different organisms exhibit different reproductive behaviors. And when they want to attract mating partners, they exhibit a lot. For example, lions, they will roar and make loud noises to show that they are powerful in order to attract the females. If you are not a lion, you can't do that. So you can't attract a female lion, period. So the inability of members of other species to perform these kind of behaviors to attract mating partners from different species means that they are reproductively isolated. And that isolation is making sure that sex does not happen in the first place. So it is a prezygotic isolation. Notice that as well. Then you can have mechanical isolation. In mechanical isolation, they attempt to have sex. They attempt to copulate or mate. So copulation is attempted, but transfer of sperms does not take place due to the differences in genital parts. So an organism that has the genital part on the dorsal side and another one that has the sex organs on the ventral side, different positions. So even though they can attempt to mate, delivery of sperms or delivery of gametes cannot happen. And so even if they've tried to mate, it is not a successful mating because there is no penetration and subsequent delivery of sperms. That is particularly important. And every organism is created in such a way that the genitals or reproductive parts are placed in areas that correspond. So there's a reason why humans have their penis placed at where they are, and females also have the vagina placed at where they are. There's a reason why fowls have theirs placed at the position that they are placed, and the dogs have theirs placed at that position. And they always correspond to the males and females of that same species. Other species might vary, and so that is fundamentally important. Then we can have ecological isolation. In this case, populations have different habitat preferences within the same community. So even in a forest community, the fact that one organism decides to live on top of trees and another one decides to live under the trees means that those guys are separated in terms of where their habitat locations are. So I don't think any let's say ostrich that walks at the floor of the forest can be able to climb up and go and mate with an eagle, because they have different habitat locations within the same ecosystem. That is a form of reproductive isolation called ecological isolation, by mere fact that they have different habitats within the same community. That is important. The same way, even if we come to human community, if you live in Amekom Kumase and you want to date the daughter of a rich man who lives at Trasako and attends school at Galaxy International School and attends one of the top international schools. So you never meet the person in school, you never meet the person at church. You can't even live in that neighborhood. Like, there's no way you're going to meet that person. Why are you going to meet Dangote's daughter? Like, just think about it. Where are you going to meet Dangote's daughter? Like, even if some people for a whole life, for their lifetime, can never find any possible place where they can come face to face with Bill Gates' son. Do you get it? So just by the different locations or the different predispositions we have within the same human community means that it is never possible for you to even go and meet them and probably mate with them and interbreed with them. So that's a type of isolation. So the last thing I'll talk about, then we close, is post-zygotic isolation. So all the things I've explained are things that make sure that mating does not even happen in the first place. So that's why they are pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms. Now, what I'm going to talk about now are things that separate isolation mechanisms that make sure that even though sexual intercourse or mating can occur, there will not be successful reproduction or formation of zygotes. So first thing is gametic incompatibility. So assuming two organisms meet successfully, a human being mates with a dog, and then there's complete delivery of sperms. Human sperms have a chromosome haploid number of 23. Dogs have a different chromosome number. There is gametic incompatibility. A human being cannot get a dog pregnant. A dog cannot get a human being pregnant. Case closed. Just because of gametic incompatibility, even though sex has happened, there is no way birth or reproduction is going to happen out of it because of gametic incompatibility. There is also called what you call zygote mortality. In this case, fertilization of the egg takes place, but the zygote will die, it won't survive because of a lot of genetic factors that will happen. There's also what we call hybrid unviability. This is a formation of an embryo that occurs, but of reduced viability. So in the case of the moo that I talked about, even that one, it's the embryo develops after this. But in this case of hybrid unviability, the how do you call it? The organisms are able to mate. They produce an offspring, which is a hybrid, but then the hybrid is less viable. So less viability means that they can, in limited instances, be able to reproduce. Not that they can't reproduce at all. There's limited instance of that happening. But then there is a second case of what we call hybrid sterility. In hybrid sterility, the hybrid is viable, but resulting adult is sterile in that particular regard. So how do you get this? For example, in the case of the ligress, they are able to produce a hybrid hybrid embryo that develops into an adult that is giving birth to, but the ligress can never be able to produce a sterile in that condition. Then there's also something called hybrid breakdown. So in the first generation, F1 generation, the hybrids are viable or fertile, but then further generations, that's the F2, may be unviable or sterile. So all of these things happen to prevent reproductive success, even though the sexual intercourse has happened between the organisms but then this isolation mechanism will make sure that interbreeding continuously does not become possible. So notice that finally, whatever the cause of isolation, there is no doubt about the fact that one is the most that it is one of the most important factors that is responsible for speciation. So Maunyo, once again, your question becomes clearer in this statement that regardless of the form of isolation, it is one of the most important conditions that will result in the formation of species. Because we know that whenever you separate organisms, they will respond differently to the environment and might get some mutations or differences, acquired differences. If they are able to come back together and mate with themselves, then the differences will be merged together because they will share the genes. Their children will have the genes from both sides, so they will blend it. But whenever reproduction is not possible, then it means that everybody will keep the differences to themselves. And when these differences are kept to the individual different population, to the different populations that are separated, it means that we are likely going to have two different species sometime on the evolutionary time scale. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an interesting conversation about evolution and speciation. We are unable to continue with others because we are fast behind time. But I consider this as an interesting conversation, and